Good evening and welcome to the channel's studios here in London with your international news around the world in 5. A ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah has come into effect in Lebanon after more than a year of fighting. Here, residents in the city of Tyre celebrating as the ceasefire took effect. It puts to an at least temporary end to nearly 14 months of conflict between Israel and the Iran-backed militant group. The deal was announced by Israel, France and the US, with President Joe Biden saying it aimed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. Attacks by both sides were recorded until shortly before the ceasefire started. Fighting had been ongoing for nearly a year when in late September Israel intensified bombardments and launched a ground invasion against Hezbollah. The war has been Lebanon's deadliest in decades, killing more than 3,823 people, according to local officials.
Mr. Speaker, the ceasefire announced in Lebanon is long overdue, but demonstrates that diplomacy can succeed even in the most challenging of circumstances. We must seize this opportunity to build trust, de-escalate tensions, and push for a wider ceasefire.
An Egyptian diver who helped in the rescue operation after a tourist boat sank in the Red Sea says rescuers had to search the vessel by torchlight to find its passengers and crew. Rescuers found 4 bodies and 5 survivors on Tuesday after Sea Story, which was carrying 44 passengers and crew, sank on Monday after reportedly being hit by a large wave near Marsa Alam. The victims' identities have not yet been disclosed by authorities. Opposition supporters in Pakistan have temporarily called off protests demanding the release of jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan a day after marching on central Islamabad. Protesters had vowed not to leave the capital until Khan's release, but as they breached barriers and made their way to Democracy Square on Tuesday, they were pushed back by police and were met with volleys of tear gas. At least 6 people, 4 security officers and 2 civilians, have died in clashes during the latest protests, which began on Sunday. Khan's party said in a statement that the protests had been temporarily suspended due to the government's brutality. A police officer who tasered a 95-year-old woman with dementia symptoms at an Australian care home has been found guilty of her manslaughter. Christian White used his weapon on Claire Nowland after the great-grandmother was found wandering with a small kitchen knife in the early hours of the 17th of May 2023. Her death a week later caused public outcry, but White, a senior constable, argued at trial that his use of force was reasonable and proportionate to the threat. Voting is underway in Namibia in what could be the most competitive election since independence from white-ruled South Africa 34 years ago. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah is seeking to become the country's first female president. She is the candidate of the governing Southwest Africa's People's Organisation to replace Hage Geingob after he died in February after 9 years in office. But high unemployment, poverty, inequality and corruption allegations have eroded support for her party. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has announced €2.3 billion in additional aid to reconstruct Valencia after the deadliest flash floods in Spain's modern history. More than 220 people died and 5 people are still missing after torrential rains on October the 29th triggered floods that swept through the suburbs south of the regional capital Valencia. The measures are on top of the €14.36 billion previously announced. Sanchez defended the action from Spanish government during the handling of the flood crisis, adding they will keep supporting the affected areas until they completely recover their normality. And one of the innovations at this year's Paris Olympics was supposed to be an electric flying taxi service. Germany's Volocopter promised its electric-powered 2-seater aircraft, the VoloCity, would be ferrying passengers around the city. But it never happened. Instead, Volocopter was urgently trying to raise fresh investment to keep the firm going. Talks to borrow €100 million from the government failed in April. Volocopter is one of dozens of companies around the world developing an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Their machines promise the flexibility of a helicopter, but without the cost, noise and emissions. And that's your international news around the world in 5. Now back to the channel's studios in Lagos.